Hi, everybody, and welcome to this very special and unique episode of The Women's Game. Today, we're talking to an expert guest about an issue that affects all of us, climate change. And I know some of you are out there thinking, I don't come to TWG for news on climate change. I'm just here for women's football and lawn meat. But let me explain, climate change is affecting football. Earlier this year, an NWSL game in Kansas City experienced a long heat delay, sparking conversation across the league about the policies in place to protect players and fans. This summer brought record-setting temperatures across the U.S., and with our country getting ready to host the Men's World Cup along with Canada and Mexico next summer, extreme heat and increasingly severe weather events are threatening to affect sports more than ever before. And since I'm certainly not a scientist or a climate expert myself, we've brought in an expert in the space, Professor Radley Horton, who is a professor at Columbia University's Climate School. I met Professor Horton when we both spoke at a panel at Columbia University in 2023 about how climate change is impacting sports. So I thought that an expert on climate change could help us all start to make sense of how sports will be impacted by the changing world. Professor Horton is going to answer all of my questions about what's happening and why, how sports are being affected, what we can expect in the coming years, and perhaps most importantly, what we can do about it. This is definitely one of the most unique interviews that we've done here at TWG, but I feel like it's a really important topic, and I'm so eager to learn more. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Professor Radley Horton. Welcome, Professor Horton, and thank you so much for joining me here at the Women's Game. Could you just actually introduce yourself for our listeners and tell us a little bit about your work?
You bet. Yeah, great to see you. My name's Radley Horton, and I'm a climate scientist and a professor at Columbia University. And I spend most of my time studying various types of extreme weather events. So everything from heat extremes to heavy rain events, coastal flooding. And I work a lot also on thinking about the impacts of those events on society. So how do they impact human health? How do they impact our infrastructure? And collectively, as a society, what can we do to be more resilient or better prepared for those types of extreme weather events?
I will just preface that you and I both met when we participated in an event in 2023 at Columbia University about how climate change is impacting sports.
Yeah.
And I learned so much at that event. So this is kind of what I want to recreate here for our listeners.
Cool.
But before we get into the sports side, tell us what climate change is and how it's affecting the planet.
Yeah. So basically, ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning a lot of coal and when we changed some of our agricultural practices, started cutting down more forests, when we started doing more industrial activities, things like making cement, we've started to put more carbon dioxide, especially into the atmosphere. And there's now the concentrations are more than 40% higher than they were, sort of start of the Industrial Revolution, around 1750 or so. Carbon dioxide, this matters because it's a very powerful greenhouse gas, which basically means that when we increase the concentration of it in the atmosphere, it's very good at preventing or blocking the Earth's attempts to release heat back into space. So basically, when you have more greenhouse gases, some of the energy that the Earth is trying to send back out to space gets deflected down to the surface, causing a little bit of warming, and essentially meaning that the Earth has to get hotter to be able to radiate as much energy out to space as it used to. So the basic physics of why greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide should warm the planet have been pretty well understood since even going back to like late in the 19th century. But there's still so much we're learning about, for example, the effects on extreme weather events.
That makes so much sense. I think a lot of like the criticisms I'll hear are, sometimes maybe even just comparing like weather and climate and maybe not understanding how one random seeming weather event is actually a small piece of this changing climate. You mentioned the Earth has to heat up more. And I know something we've discussed before is that there's been 1 degree of warming and more degrees of warming are predicted to happen. Can you just kind of break that down for us? And why does 1 degree of warming matter? Why does it affect us so much?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. What you talked about is really the critical link in between, which is how average conditions on the planet change as we increase those greenhouse gases. So we have, as you said, seen globally now about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit or so of global warming. That might not sound like a lot when we experience, from day to night, 20 degrees Fahrenheit of variation. But as you alluded to, that small shift in averages actually profoundly changes the frequency of extreme events, so that we now have far more record-breaking high temperatures and far fewer record-breaking low temperatures, just with 2.5 degrees or so of global warming. And if you look at recent years, and this is true winter, summer, across the entire country and beyond, a lot of countries are now seeing like 4 times as many record-breaking high temperatures as record-breaking low temperatures. And it's the same story with some of the other things where average conditions are changing. So sea levels are going up, right? As we're seeing a warming ocean literally expanding and standing taller, and also some of the ice that had been on land in Greenland and Antarctica melting into the ocean and increasing the mass. So when you see those things happening and sea level increasing what sounds like just a little bit, maybe, less than a foot on the east coast of the US over the last century, the first thought might be, how could that matter? There's places where the tide varies over the course of half a day, 5 feet or more. But it's the same exact story. You push the average up a little bit, and now it's much easier to get flooding events. The things that used to happen maybe very rarely, once every 10 years, once every 100 years, can become much more common just because we're raising the floor of a higher sea level. So you get the same storm with the same surge of water you might have had in the past. Now the water is going to go that much further inland. It's going to be that much deeper. The waves are going to be that much higher, more damage and more risk of death.
Wow. Okay, so to just put this into terms for me, basically, because of an increased amount of greenhouse gases, the Earth is warming, and an average increase in global temperature is contributing to more frequent extreme weather events.
That's right. And you can get that result just by shifting the averages a little bit. If you warm every day, for example, by the same amount. So it's that increase in average temperatures. It gives us more extremes. It raises sea levels. Of course, it has other effects too. It's putting more moisture in the atmosphere, which is part of us having those heavier rain events. Spring is happening earlier. Fall is happening later. These are all consistent with effects that we see as average temperature is rising, as you said.
To your point, and like I alluded to earlier, we're all seeing these effects happen in our daily lives, I think, more and more. And sometimes it's October, I live in Vermont, and it's 85 degrees out today. And I think for some people, it's hard to equate that back to this huge thing that's happening. But I think that by having these conversations and starting to understand more why and how it's happening and what it means, hopefully we can do more about it. And so I want to start getting into the sports element, because I do think for a lot of people, the road to understanding and getting involved in fighting against climate change is through something that they love and are passionate about, that's ultimately going to be really, really affected by it. And that's so obviously so many lives are at risk, but in a small way, sports are at risk as well. And I think it's an interesting lens to look at this through. So I want to zoom into one extreme weather event. It was an extreme heat event. Earlier this year on August 16th, there was an NWSL game between the Kansas City Current and the Orlando Pride. This was one of the season's most anticipated games because at the time it was the defending champions against the team that was in first place right now. It was a really big game. Kickoff was supposed to be at 3 p.m. local time in Kansas City. It was going to be nationally broadcast on network TV, which really heightened the importance of the exact kickoff time being 3 p.m. So kicking off mid-afternoon, it's August in Kansas City. The temperature was reportedly over 93 degrees ahead of kickoff, but the NWSL policy says that it can't be over 92.3 and to go ahead with the game. Otherwise, it needs to have a heat delay. The game got delayed 3.5 hours. And then later in the day when it was cooler, they played to a 0-0 sluggish draw after this long delay. It was still hot out. The game missed its broadcast window. The players had to adjust multiple times to a different kickoff time. So what I want to ask you about here to start is the humidity factor, which I know can actually make it feel even hotter than 93 degrees. Talk to us about humidity, which is sometimes referred to as wet bulb temperature. That's at least how it's measured in the NWSL, and the effect that humidity can have on top of extreme heat.
Yeah. So, first off, kudos to the soccer leagues and other leagues for starting to, really realize that exposure to heat goes far beyond just the air temperature that we're used to hearing about. And as you said, it's not just the heat, it's the humidity, right? When we have a very dry environment, even if temperatures are really high, in theory, if people are drinking enough water, they will be able to stay cool enough, just essentially through sweating. But when we have combinations of high temperature and high humidity, it becomes much less effective for people to sweat. There's basically so much moisture in the air that less of that sweat evaporates into the air. And that evaporation is really our most important way that we cool. So yeah, that particular event that you mentioned had a wet bulb temperature above 92 degrees. So the wet bulb temperature tells you how cool the temperature can get if you have maximum evaporation, essentially. So if it's a really hot and humid day, essentially people in their sweating aren't able to cool the temperature enough to prevent overheating, right? But it's that combination of the heat and the humidity, meaning that people, especially those exerting themselves, right? I mean, these best athletes in the world pushing so hard with the stakes so high, generating huge amounts of heat. Their risk of danger, despite being so fit, right? Despite being the most fit people in the country, at some point it's just going to be so high because of that heat. And then there's the fans too, right? And then one other thing just to quickly to note, heat and humidity are the most important, but it's also like the sunlight, right? And how windy it is. Also properties of the surface. I think that was a grass field, if I'm not mistaken, for that match. But some places you have athletes, I don't know if AstroTurf is still around, but people playing on darker surfaces that get even hotter. So those are some aspects of it. But most fundamentally, as you said, it's the heat and the humidity that poses that risk.
Okay, incredible explanation of that. Thank you. What I can speak to about this is, as a player, what it feels like to play on a really hot day when it's really humid out. It does feel like your sweat isn't being evaporated. I remember after a really hot game in Houston, I was just soaked all the way through. My shorts were dripping. You feel so slow and so sluggish, and potentially, like you're not quite thinking as clearly. You're trying to focus for a set piece and you're just moving slower. Your brain just feels slower. And it really is, I think, a result of just playing in that intense heat and trying to operate at a level that your body is just desperately trying to keep up with.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think that it's so important after that to have a sort of safe environment to cool off. And are there some, non-professional athletes who don't have that, who maybe don't recover as well? But I also found myself wondering, do you think that the sort of way the game is played, like the strategy that the players or the coaches, are they in any way sort of modifying the game for the strategy for extreme conditions like that?
Yeah, I think in my experience, I feel like our strategy on all the teams I've been on was always to just outlast the other team, which is kind of in and of itself a warning sign of the attitudes that we have about extreme heat. It's we'll just toughen up. But I've certainly played in games where if you look statistically at the distance covered by players or the number of completed passes or even the score, sometimes a 0-0 game or even, paradoxically a high scoring game, which may show lack of focus defensively. I think you do see it in the product, the quality of the product on the field. When players are slow and sluggish, the game might not be as exciting. There might not be as many attacks. There might not be as many high-speed runs made, not as many runs in behind. So it's interesting to think tactically about what changes coaches and players are making intentionally and just as a result of that exhaustion. I also love that you mentioned the fans in attendance. I think, at a game like this in Kansas City, there was a moderate heat advisory issued. So when we now start to think about the effects that extreme heat and humidity have on the human body, of course, we're talking about the risk for players out there running around, but also a risk for fans who now have been outside in a 3.5-hour heat delay all day. What are your concerns for the human body in a situation like this?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would think of is, a couple things. One, the exposure, as you said, basically how much time they're spending in that heat, right? And as you said, some of those fans may have been sitting in that sunlight, but sort of for hours, waiting for that game to happen. So they're just accumulating more and more hours of exposure, right? But then I think the other thing is that's going to be a wide cross section of society, the people, at that game. Some of them are going to have cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, kidney issues. All those types of conditions are exacerbated, made worse by extreme heat. And we actually know from looking at just the statistics of, to put it bluntly, how many people die on really hot days, that especially people with those pre-existing health conditions die at a much higher rate when it's really, really hot. So, we can't sort of focus on just a single day necessarily. You wouldn't see it there, but if you start averaging all the people around the country and the world, sitting out on a really hot day, pre-existing health conditions, some of them really elderly, those are the kind of things that are going to make some people just far more vulnerable. We need people with different expertise to get into all the specifics, but it does strike me as sort of an interesting trade-off. On the one hand, not a trade-off, but they're different risk for the athletes or the fans, right? For the athletes, to generalize, people in incredible shape, but when exercising, generating all this heat and energy, right? That's going to pose a threat to them. And then we have the fans who may be, relaxing more, but far more likely to have some pre-existing health conditions that make them vulnerable. So I guess the bottom line, as you said, is risk for both groups, the athletes and the fans, for sure.
It's scary to think about this just in general without thinking about exerting yourself to this extreme. And as a former professional soccer player, it's even scarier to imagine that we're putting athletes at risk in these situations. I do think that we've found some ways to try to combat extreme weather. In soccer, we have hydration breaks. Those get taken halfway through each half when the wet bulb temperature is above 82 degrees Fahrenheit. I've also experienced a bunch of other heat mitigation strategies. We've dipped our hands into ice tubs. I've worn an ice vest during my warm up. I've eaten what we call slurries, which are basically like little slushies with electrolytes in them to try to cool down that internal body temperature. I've done all sorts of heat acclimation training, which is a conversation for another time. But I'm curious if you've seen any other sports mitigate extreme temperatures with solutions that you think are interesting or good.
Some of those examples that you gave are really fantastic. I haven't heard a lot of other examples from sports, but I've heard of some companies that are starting to be at the vanguard of thinking about these issues as well. Some, for example, construction companies that are starting similarly to do cooling vests, like you mentioned, or to have something like a buddy system where, a couple people who are working together can monitor each other during heat. Is somebody showing signs of not being able to think quite as clearly, or anything else that could put them at further risk, for example, on a construction site. And monitoring, right? We're starting to get into an era, I bet you're seeing this in sports too, where we can actually maybe keep track of someone's body temperature or pulse, things like that can help us see some of these warning signs maybe early.
That's really fascinating. I think all of these leagues, even as you mentioned, construction workers who are out working in the heat, anytime you're doing something during the summer months, the sports leagues, we're also fighting for a national TV audience. Extreme heat is going to continue being an issue. And it's with the TV broadcast schedule, it's not just as simple as moving the games to nighttime. Those daytime broadcast slots are really valuable, and we're getting national exposure there. Our soccer league needs that. And then additionally, Professor Horton, we saw a report from Football for Future, which is a nonprofit aimed towards building a more environmentally sustainable football community. The report was in conjunction with Common Goal, which is a network dedicated to creating more equality across football. We can link to both organizations in the show notes, but this report said that soon there's going to be a lot more unplayable days, meaning days that are so hot that we can't play on them. So sports seasons might be forced to either shorten, move, and access to fields and stadiums may become more limited, which sounds, like potentially women's sports would get bumped even further.
Get marginalized, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And other countries actually play their soccer seasons from September to May. And this is where my next question is going. That's not really possible in the US because winters here in major markets like Chicago, New York, Boston are unplayable in the winter. And so I think obviously it's like, yeah, we think winter, we think there's going to be snow on the ground in Chicago. You can't play there. But I think climate change is affecting winter weather in more extreme ways than just temperature and snow. And I was hoping you could tell us about some of the warnings around what could change about the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, I want to kind of reinforce, though, the point that you made that like people often, whether it's sports or anything else, talk about adaptation to climate change, right? Becoming more resilient. And there are a lot of steps we can take, but you noted that a lot of those have trade-offs or they're not cost-free. Like, as you said, ideally, play these games later into the evening, but it might not be possible to get the markets for, non-professional teams. There might not be lights in the evening, you name it. And then specifically for this issue of the winter sports, winter is changing a lot, for sure. If we look at the coldest day per year, it's a lot warmer than it used to be across, most of the U.S. We'll still get these occasional strong cold air outbreaks, but they're not as common as they used to be. But what's really changing is the length of the snow season is shortening. And even during the heart of the winter, it's less likely to have that snow persist on the ground because it's getting warmer. It's more likely to melt. Without knowing too much about the specifics, my initial thought about stretching seasons into winter in the north, probably, it's still going to be too cold during the heart of winter, but maybe it's still going to be hard during the heart of the winter, but maybe the shoulder seasons change a little bit. Maybe whereas before you tended to stop October 15th, maybe now you can push it to November 15th. So those are, I think, the kind of creative, solutions maybe we need to be thinking. And the same thing on the spring side, right? Maybe you can start a little earlier. Yeah.
It's so, and for some reason, I wasn't expecting that answer because a big conversation in the soccer community is, should we shift the calendar to match the global calendar, which would be playing from September to May? I still wonder if a league like the NWSL should do that and risk playing in these really cold markets in January and February. But it sounds like if we're really forward thinking about climate change, unfortunately, that could become an option. So I'm fascinated by that. And you started to kind of touch on, there's costs associated with making these kinds of changes. And I want to talk about some of those costs that we're already seeing. There are a lot of climate related threats to sports in our country. And one of them just last year at Tropicana Field, which is the Tampa Bay Rays home stadium, it was exposed to 100-mile-per-hour winds from Hurricane Milton and had its roof torn off. And so infrastructure damage is costly in a lot of ways. It can result in repair costs, insurance increases, and then, of course, all the costs associated with missed games and events for an organization. I think I want to talk about climate change, the risk that climate change could have on sporting infrastructure, what that might mean for sports in general. Like, are there any maybe recent designs of infrastructures, arenas, stadiums, you've seen accounting for climate change?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think that there's more requirements around the U.S. that we build, outside of flood zones, and that more protections are included. But as we saw with that recent example, there always have been those extreme weather events. There's always going to be hurricanes. But on balance, most types of events, as you said, are getting worse. So I think we need to have that conversation more. What are the most vulnerable facilities? Are there ways to make them less vulnerable? Can we do retrofits? And as you noted, it's the stadiums, but also like the training facilities, right? And maybe also we need to be thinking about the supporting infrastructure that's getting people to the games. If our highways are going to be underwater, for example, if some of these cities are going to be threatened by more wildfires or, poor air quality, one of the things that's going to mean is sort of more strain on emergency management and some of those types of folks that can play a critical role when there's any sort of huge event. It strikes me as a field that needs much more attention, right? There are a lot of groups thinking about adapting infrastructure to climate change, but you're pointing out the need to sort of really key in on the infrastructure side of sports, as you said. Those are kind of conversations that I think we need to have more of. And you mentioned insurance. I think that is probably an issue that's front and center.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you brought up a few things that we're actually about to get to. I did want to just mention while we're on it, and this is unfair because I have these notes in front of me, but there is Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle which is the first zero carbon certified arena in the world. It operates on 100% renewable energy. And one thing I thought was really cool about it, which I think it's so important that there is something like this. That's why I wanted to bring it up, that they are forward thinking. They are preparing for climate change. They are trying to be more sustainable. The ice rink, when the arena turns into an ice rink for the Seattle Kraken's NHL games, is made out of roof harvested rainwater, which I thought was like a really cool fact.
You're getting us into such an important topic, not just how do we respond to extreme weather events and high temperatures, but what can we do to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the first place and to conserve more water so that we get less extreme weather events in the future so they don't accelerate as quickly. So that the conversation about emissions reduction or greenhouse gas mitigation. And that's a super interesting example you just described. Here again, I think sports leagues is such a huge part of our economy. It touches all sectors of society, whether people believe in climate change or not. It's such a huge part of the economy, everything from supporting infrastructure that we build to the food vendors and procurement. These are all places to have conversations, not just as we've been talking about how to protect workers more, how to protect the public from extreme weather, but also how to reduce those emissions in the first place. And what are the examples we can key in on where you actually save money if you go a little bit greener, if you reduce waste, if you reduce water usage? In some cases, cost of solar and wind are becoming cheaper than the fossil fuels that contributed to this greenhouse gas problem. So it's an area of innovation. I think that I don't know the specific economics of that stadium, but if we see soccer leagues and others showing this way forward, it can be a growth area. One example I like to give is that if we sort of compare this to the case of traditional combustion engine vehicles versus electric vehicles. The traditional combustion engine is not, it had tons of innovations through history, right? You look at how traditional cars advanced. You're not seeing major innovations today in traditional cars. But if you look at the emerging technologies, the green technologies like batteries, you're seeing very rapid innovations. You're seeing the cost of those batteries come down fast. So I think the specifics differ, but in general, a lot of these green energy opportunities, if they're not quite cost effective yet versus fossil fuels, they're getting there quickly. And eventually it'll start to happen with other things like cement, which right now burns a ton of fossil fuels. We'll come up with new varieties that, require a lot less.
It sounds like a positive and a thing to be optimistic about, that because this is a newer industry, we have not gone through all of the innovation that we can yet. And we will continue finding new ways to make these more sustainable initiatives more cost effective, which is a good thing. There's one more big, scary climate change thing that we've been seeing beyond floods, storm surges, hurricanes. Even when the stadiums are okay, even when the temperature's okay, there is wildfires, which are scary in and of themselves. The imminent threat of wildfires could result in potential loss of life and property. Actually, an NWSL player who plays in LA for Angel City, her name's Allie Riley. She lost her childhood home this year in the Pacific Palisades to the wildfires in California. And that's just this horrible, stark reminder that these things are happening to people we know, and it is related to, it's somebody close to you. Yeah. But wildfires also contribute to low air quality. And I want to learn a little bit about that. Can you talk to us about how, the threat of wildfires and then how they're contributing to this low air quality?
Wildfires are becoming more frequent across the U.S. There's a lot of reasons for it. Certainly one piece of it is changes over time in our forest management. For a long time, we really stopped fires almost entirely, for example, in national parks. And paradoxically, not allowing these small fires to burn often means bigger fires when they finally happen. But that is very far from the whole story. There's a lot of other things that are leading to more of these fires. Some of it also is more people moving into forested areas, so you can get more ignitions, essentially. But Undeniably, one of the main drivers is the higher air temperatures. As temperatures are going up, that warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, as I alluded to earlier. That means basically, even if you got the same amount of rainfall you got in the past, now that higher temperature is going to take more moisture out of our trees, out of our soils, setting them up so that when conditions are right, they'll burn more and more explosively. And it probably connects back somewhat to what we were talking about with winter too. When you had a winter with a very extensive snowpack, it takes time, especially if we're talking about some of those mountain regions with forests. It takes well into spring and sometimes summer historically for all that snow to melt. Until it melts, you still have, and even after it melts, you have moisture in that soil. But as temperatures are going up, we're seeing more instances of that snow disappearing early in the year. That also sets the stage for things to dry out more quickly. So climate change and warmer temperatures are one of the drivers of these bigger wildfires. We're also seeing it in Canada more and more. And the last few fire seasons across big stretches of Canada have been worse than we've seen. And as you suggested, tragic and catastrophic for the folks directly affected. That's where we need to start. But one of the implications is far downstream, sometimes hundreds to thousands of miles. You do have especially those small particulates, the PM 2.5, particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns, I believe it is. Those tiny particles, especially if you're playing sports, but for anybody, when you take a deep breath, they can cross your lungs and basically the blood, get into the bloodstream where they can cause inflammation, damage to the sort of, core aspects of the lung and really, have permanent effects on folks. And then when you have, this is much more rare, but when you have, tragic wildfires like that one in LA, you also frankly have to ask what else is burning, right? Besides, say, forest, because we're worried more and more about, everything in our modern society, essentially, as it burns, some of those things are going to be carcinogens. Some of those things, frankly, we don't know what effects they're going to have. So here too, we could go in a lot of directions, right, about what we should do. But maybe the professional leagues, hopefully, are keeping track of, air quality. They probably are. But what about, some of the school communities that don't have the resources, they don't have the staff necessarily to, whether it's taking local readings themselves or just, looking at the reports, who is being exposed to these types of dangers.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really great point about how, I've been asking all these questions about these are professional athletes and we have ice vests and we're dipping our hands into these ice containers to cool off. Youth sports don't necessarily have all of those resources. And I think I'm curious how extreme heat or any of these other extreme weather events are going to affect kids. I actually specifically remember from our panel together that inner city sporting events are often hotter because of the lack of tree coverage. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how these environmental factors actually have the potential to affect underserved communities disproportionately.
Yeah, I think it's environmental and social factors, socioeconomic factors in some cases. So cities do tend to be warmer, right? So like all cities and all neighborhoods in cities, but so in general, people in cities are going to often have their heat waves be a little hotter. But then certain neighborhoods too, as you said, with less tree cover, with more asphalt, are going to be even hotter than surrounding neighborhoods. And the effects of extreme heat are, what we call very nonlinear, which basically means each additional degree of warming causes more damage than the last. If it's a really hot day and the temperature's 104 in a neighborhood instead of 102, due to some of these lack of trees or you name it, those last 2 degrees are going to have a huge impact on people's health and risk of having heat exhaustion or heat stress, in a way that 2 degrees warmer wouldn't matter as much if it was cooler. So honing in on your question, the implications for kids, we're especially going to be concerned about kids in inner cities that may be experiencing higher temperatures locally because they don't have tree cover, because there's a lot of asphalt. But then it extends to many other dimensions too. children in general aren't going to be as good at self-monitoring or sort of self-protective behavior. They're not going to be able to say as quickly, I don't feel right, I feel disoriented, or they're going to be maybe less able to know to, drink a lot of water. And then when we start to compare different school systems or different leagues, just making sure that all the leagues have access to environmental data, telling about, when conditions are risky, coaches who are there to sort of make those decisions, whether to cancel a game or take more breaks, you name it. And then also, some communities experience worse air quality too. So some communities that may be near freeways or that have a lot of environmental contaminants, when that heat wave happens, they're getting a double whammy. They're experiencing the extreme heat and the poor air quality. Put those two things together, they might be more than additive, meaning that you might get like more than double the effects if you're suddenly, getting a double whammy of heat and poor air quality. We don't know, right? We're learning, but what we do know is these communities are really at risk.
Do you have any advice for parents who want to be active in thinking about this within their communities? What questions should parents of young athletes be asking?
Great question. Who is monitoring for dangerous conditions? Who's making sure there's not a heat advisory forecast? Are the decisions going to be made based on that scientific information? Mm-hmm. Would someone make the call not to, have a sporting event if kids are at risk? Of course, we'd all love to think that everyone would make that call, but some people may not, some decision makers may not fully understand those risks or, might, through no bad intention of their own, just feel something like, our kids are healthy, they'll be okay, right? I think we all can be prone at times to that kind of wishful thinking, but we need to avoid against that kind of thing. We have to protect the most vulnerable. And kids, frankly, even if exposed to the exact same temperatures as adults, are generally, especially very young children, are going to be more at risk even to the same temperature. So what are the environmental conditions? Is anyone tracking them? Are we going to be able to are we going to make decisions based on that information? Those are the kind of questions I think that we need to ask. Would we be punished if we kept our kids out of a sporting event? Would there be a feeling of, they didn't suck it up? That kind of thing.
That sounds like really important questions for parents to be thinking about. And I'm really glad that we touched on that. I want to circle back to maybe our last big topic, and then we're going to quickly go into some takeaways for us all to leave this conversation with. But the Men's World Cup is a huge talking point for the entire global soccer community because it's coming here to North America next summer. It's going to be hosted by the US, Mexico, and Canada. And I keep thinking about the opening game, which will be in Mexico City, a huge spectacle. This is an enormous global event. Outside that stadium, though, the city itself, Mexico City, has already been greatly affected by drought. And what I want to know, you touched on this earlier when you said with big events, like in an already a heat wave or an extreme weather event, emergency resources are already really needed in that area. And then to have this huge influx of people and athletes come through that area, I want to hear about how big sporting events like the World Cup, like the Olympics, can contribute to or accelerate climate change or kind of increase some of these dangers and risks by putting extra strain on an area.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of parts to it. I mean, most fundamentally, there are going to be greenhouse gas emissions from all those extra flights. Tourists, if we're going to grossly overgeneralize, are probably going to be living a little more extractive life than local populations, probably using more water during the time that they're there. Maybe just jumping into one sector to sort of give the example of what you're talking about. You mentioned drought in Mexico City and water. So all these extra people coming to the city, all the hotel rooms, and on average, they're going to be using more water probably than the local residents who are used to dealing with drought and just know the local context better, know how to conserve water. So that's going to be one thing. Tourists just directly using more water. Then we also have water associated with all the facilities, right? Having to, I don't know if there are misters used, for example, to keep people cool. We need that, right? That's an example of one of those trade-offs.
Yeah.
You got to do it.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. But it is going to use some water. Keeping the fields in a good condition, right? How much water does that take? Building infrastructure to the extent that they had to build new stadiums, fix up roads. Those are kind of, takes water to make cement. Maybe you're using water to keep dust down. All these might seem like little things, when considered in isolation, but you put them together and they add up. They could lead to, no, I can't speak to Mexico City specifically. It'll depend to some extent on the upcoming rain, but all things being equal, that's going to, lead to groundwater extraction and, not be so sustainable. So it raises a lot of interesting questions. You're talking about the ability of sports leagues and the broader economy to sort of be good stewards. And also, I think part of that is maybe informing and educating tourists that might visit for those events, how they can be present in that local place, certainly through the stadium and the team fundamentally, but also a little more generally. What does it mean to not sort of over extract, from some of those communities? So those would be some dimensions of it. Yeah, another really big one you said, just having all the emergency managers, police, all those groups sort of focused on the events. God forbid you do have a broader natural disaster. It's it's going to stretch and strain things, and making sure that it's not local populations that are sort of ignored or suffer. This is not a Mexico City specific example, but just a broader point about the challenges. And of course, as better than I, there are also huge benefits that come to communities and cross-cultural exchange. But if we can do these things in more environmentally sound ways that protect people and reduce emissions and water usage, that's a win-win.
Yeah, I love that you actually started to turn it around to the positive, because I do think we've been talking a lot about some depressing things that are really scary. I did recently read something that is starting to give me a little bit of hope. Yes, the World Cup will present a big strain on our environment. There's going to be those increased carbon emissions from air travel, potential stadium construction. But kind of like you said, it is bringing this community together. And I actually think it's a great opportunity to show a way that a big event like this could be environmentally more responsible. And I want to bring up, I actually coached, I'm involved locally with this club here in Vermont called Vermont Green.
I saw that.
I coached the women's team over the summer. And the club is committed to becoming a net zero organization. Their mission is so inspiring. And I think looking at a club like that, for all the teams coming here for the World Cup, for FIFA, for all of the kind of corporate sponsors and organizations that will be involved in such a big event, to look to a club like Vermont Green and say they're doing X, Y, and Z. We should do X, Y, and Z. It's an opportunity to demonstrate how to be more forward-thinking when it comes to being environmentally sustainable. My question is, what would you hope to see from these organizers and corporate sponsors who are choosing to focus their efforts on combating climate change at the World Cup?
Yeah, I think it mirrors what we've been talking about. Pledges to protect the vulnerable from extreme weather events and pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the common theme maybe is being courageous and having the climate conversation. Even if you don't want to talk about climate change, everybody cares about children. Almost everybody cares about sports. We all know that there are extreme weather events that create vulnerability. What can we all do to better protect stadium workers, experiencing extreme heat, making decisions to protect the most vulnerable populations. But maybe, where you can have even bigger impact is in the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Other things, how about public service announcements? How about things that might not appear to be profitable from an advertising perspective, but advertising campaigns that emphasize keeping people hydrated. It's not just during the game, right? But before, afterwards, do you have a cool place to take people, after they've exerted themselves? Do you know how to look for evidence of heat extremes, public awareness campaigns around that? Or maybe it's things related to extreme events, encouraging people to have a to-go bag, packed with essentials. One of the challenges is that, I'm no business expert, but one of the challenges is there's no financial incentive really for anyone to get these messages out. So maybe that's one of the places that some of these sports leagues can help, because people will listen to those kind of messages from trusted sources, and people like yourself who clearly, it's just, palpable how much you care about these things. Even, mundane things like steps you can take to prevent damage, flooding in a basement, right? Can you elevate some critical electronic equipment, for example, in basements? Checking your insurance policy. Some of these things start to sound pretty challenging, but is your insurance policy protect you against what you think it does? Wind, flooding. These aren't easy things to do. Some of them come with initial effort, potentially some cost, but they also can save a lot of money and potentially lives over time. So I think messaging, having the courage to have that conversation about climate and potentially scary things like risk, but framing it as an opportunity to protect people, to build out in a better way, and in a way that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and, can help the economy going forward. If you look at how the cost of batteries has come down, how solar and wind have gotten so cheap. Frankly, these are going to be huge growth industries if we step up in the U.S. And make those investments. And they'll also reduce the exposure of people to hazards.
There's a huge onus on these huge organizations to do their part, because they are perhaps contributing so much more than the average person. And this is really my last question for you. As we start to absorb all of this information, all of these steps that organizations should take, people are going to want to know, what should we do as an individual? I love the examples you gave about protecting yourself. I think those are things I would have never thought of. But I also love that you said companies and corporate sponsors should be thinking, what good can they do, not just what money can they make.
Right.
A PSA for how to handle an extreme weather event or an extreme heat event would give so much back to the community that this sponsor is perhaps extracting money from.
Right.
So I'm a person who just listened to this podcast. I want to do my part. I love sports. I want to help the earth. I know that this is going to be an issue going forward. And I think I just want to know your simple advice for the average person on how to help combat climate change and how to keep this conversation top of mind.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say that, maybe isn't what folks always hear is that, we are at the end of the day a social species. There's a lot of, divisions in society now. Maybe there always are. Just have the conversation if this is an issue you care about. Maybe it's at that sporting event, with your kids in a non-contentious way. Just, talk about some of these exposures to heat, and because there's a shared goal of keeping everyone safe, right? So just, being willing to, in a non-confrontational way, talk about these issues if they're important to you, and also to listen. In terms of reducing our emissions, investing in insulation for the home can be hugely impactful. Things like double paned windows. For some people, going to solar and wind will make sense. Solar power will make sense. That does have costs associated with it, but it usually will pay off. Anything we do to reduce the amount that we fly, to reduce the amount that we drive, these kind of things can make a difference in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions.
I'll just wrap up by thanking you so much. I feel like I learned so much. I think just even the idea of having this conversation more now suddenly feels a lot more doable. I think there's a lot of pressure on these conversations to get them exactly right and to be right. And I think it would be really powerful to just be talking about it more and brainstorming ways for all of us to contribute and do our part. So I'm so grateful you took the time to be here with us. I know our community is going to really appreciate this conversation. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Great talking to you.